see such a full house, and great to have an opportunity to talk to our engaged and educated Vancouver audience about some really important issues. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we thank them for allowing us to be here. So my name is Deborah Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of the Adaptation to Climate Change team, which is based at the Pacific Water Research Centre at Simon Fraser University's Faculty of Environment. For the last 11 years, I've been researching climate change impacts that will affect Canadians and developing research on how we can respond at all levels of society through policy and practice. And this is the fourth in a series of 5 talks on sea level rise that we've been partnering on with the Pacific Water Research Centre, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions based at the University of Victoria, the City of Vancouver, and the Vancouver Aquarium. And it's really been a great example of organizations coming together to work together on solutions, and that's always the conclusion that we find with working on climate change impacts, such as the one we're going to talk about tonight. We've got to get out of our silos, we've got to learn from one another. The expertise is always in the room if you're willing to listen and look for it. So just to give you a bit of an overview, why are we talking about sea level rise and what is it? Well, it's a climate change. It's an effect of climate change. It's caused by water getting warmer and expanding. It's also caused by ice that is situated on land melting and going into the sea. So, you know, if you have a glass of water with ice cubes and the ice melts, the level of the water won't change because there's no water being added. What we have is places like Greenland and areas of Antarctica where there's a lot of land-based ice that's beginning to melt off and going to the sea, and that's causing a measurable amount of sea level rise. The current BC provincial guidelines for sea level rise are 1 metre by 2100, 2 metres by 2200. Obviously, by the time we get out past 2100 and even to 2100, we're in somewhat unknown territory. There's a lot of uncertainty in this, but that's the best guidelines they've come up with to date. But it's not as simple as just 1 metre of sea level rise. Climate change agitates the atmosphere. When things get warmer, it's getting hotter. So extreme events get bigger and more intense. And so we have to factor in things like, what's the highest storm surge going to be? How high is the highest tide, the king tides that come in November, going to be? How much room do we need to leave between the top of the water and a safe margin for a pavement or something like that? So right now, by some calculations, 1 metre turns into 3.3 metres that we have to compensate for. So this is going to cause damage to our coastal areas, and small island nations and delta-based civilizations will be most affected. And that's a lot of people when you look around the world. That's Egypt, that's Vietnam, that's Thailand, and it's areas of Canada and obviously areas of the States. And you could say that right now the residents of Barbuda, who have all moved to their neighbor Antigua, and residents of Puerto Rico who are fleeing to Florida are early examples of climate change refugees. There have always been hurricanes in hurricane season, but they're getting bigger, and some people are attributing a fingerprint already of the warming that we're worried about in those events. Some northern Inuit coastal towns and some southern US tribes are also already facing displacement due to melting permafrost and coastal erosion. And we in Canada, if we want to talk about refugees, we're already welcoming refugees from many countries for many different reasons. Canada is ranked as the 4th most welcoming country in the world. And since November 2015, just in one example, we've welcomed 40,000 Syrian refugees. Now, displacement of people is a complex issue and is caused by geopolitics and many other challenges, but climate change is beginning to be identified as a destabilizing factor in that movement. So to take Syria as an example, there was a severe drought that may have been linked to climate change in the years leading up to the refugee crisis that may have contributed to the conditions that resulted in civil war. So we have to take this very seriously, because projections show a range of between 50 and 350 million people displaced by climate change by 2050. That's not very long away 40 years. And a significant portion of these will be moving from the coastal areas that will be disturbed by sea level rise. Now, in the 11 years I've been working on adaptation, we not only talk about collaboration, we talk about being proactive. We don't want people to suffer. We can see these issues coming down the pike. So we want to talk about how can we plan ahead for impacts we can see coming and propose ways to respond at all levels of society. So this evening we're honoured to welcome 3 guests, 3 panellists who are working on different aspects of this issue. We have one international speaker, Dr. Saleemul from Bangladesh, Dr. Jamie Horncastle, who's a lecturer here at SFU, and Anna Zhuo, who's a co-founder of the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project. And we're going to begin with Dr. Horncastle. So Dr. Horncastle is a lecturer in the Hellenic Studies program at Simon Fraser. He's a specialist in the history of the Balkans, and his research focuses on how conflict and refugee movements helped give rise to the contemporary national and state identities in the region during the 20th century. He's currently pursuing research on the role of population movements and security in Southeast Europe. The contemporary refugee crisis has brought into sharp relief the security issues brought on by population movements, but this is not a new phenomenon. His current project helps show how climate variances have played a crucial role in the past in facilitating both population movements and conflict in the 20th century, and how states and peoples responded to these developments in the past can help inform future responses. So thanks very much, Jamie.
Well, thank you everybody for having me here today. So the current refugee crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, although downplayed in media accounts since the EU-Turkish agreement in 2016 stemmed the flow of migrants to Europe, remains a significant issue for the region and the European Union. Although the sheer numbers of refugees reaching Europe have declined from a peak of over 1.3 million new arrivals in 2015 to likely 300,000 this year, over 4.7 million registered refugees remain in the Middle East, with the countries hosting them often lacking the resources and political drive to deal with such an influx. The crisis, in short, has brought into focus the fact that states are critically unprepared for dealing with mass migration. From basic aspects of everyday life, such as housing, food, and communications, to reactionary polities and nation-states unable or unwilling to cope with such an influx, refugees face a difficult task in adapting to their new locales. Starting with the current Mediterranean refugee crisis, I will look at how states and the refugees themselves have confronted and adapted to the current situation. Finally, I will examine how climate change and rising sea levels will create future environmental refugees, specifically in the case of Egypt. While there is a tendency, both scholarly and legally, to distinguish between environmental and political refugees, many of the issues they and the states they relocate to remain the same. So here's just the current status in 2017 of the refugees arriving in Europe. You can see here that the numbers are relatively low, but this is only up until June. Generally, June through September, October is when there's significantly more refugees arriving due to changing Mediterranean climate. But I'll come back to the start of the crisis. The common perception of the current refugee crisis is that it began with the Arab Spring in 2011, when states in Northwest Africa and the Middle East, under authoritarian rulers, pushed for increased liberty in the region. While the perception that democracy matters over other concerns fits within our beliefs of the region that there is a democratic deficit, there is also a practical reason for the emergence of the Arab Spring: climate change. Using Egypt as an example, starting in 2007 through 2008, the price of grain rose 37% due to crop failures in the region, and elsewhere the scientists have attributed to climate change. Given that Egyptians rely on bread for 50% of their calories, and that 50% of their food needs to be imported, the increased prices strain the Egyptian social welfare system to the point of breaking. As a result, the regime of Hosni Mubarak fell due to the strains brought on by a hungry populace. He would not be alone, as the pattern replicated itself throughout the region, with the results most felt in Syria. Syria, under the al-Assad family, had previously experienced discontent, most notably in 1992. Yep.
Hello, Dr. Huck. How are you? Can you hear me okay? Laurie, I don't think he can hear me. Can you hear me, Dr. Huck? Okay. Well, Jamie, continue. Hey, technology.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, I'll come back here. Most notably in 1982, when Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, brutally suppressed an uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood. While discontent simmered in Syria throughout this period, Syria experienced prolonged drought from 2006 through 2011. As you can see here on this graph, you can see normal percentage of rainfall within Syria. 2007 through 2008 is representative of this period. You can see that there's a significant decline. This had two effects. First, large number of farmers, unable to support themselves on their land, fled for the city so they might avail themselves of government services. The Syrian social support system, however, was already strained by 1.7 million Iraqi refugees who have fled that country in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion in 2003. Syrians, increasingly dissatisfied with the inability of the al-Assad regime to supply the basic necessities of life, demanded political reform. Although initially non-violent, the protesters increasingly turned to arms as the regime attempted to violently disperse them. By 2011, the Syrian Civil War began in earnest. With neither the pro- or anti-government forces able to impose their will upon the other side, Syria has degenerated into a multifaceted civil conflict that is ongoing today. Although the suffering of the Syrian people experience is beyond the scope of this presentation, the area where individuals probably are most aware of it is through the vast displacement of the country's population. Syria, before the war, possessed a population of 22 million people. Over half of these, 13.5 million, have been displaced from their homes. A further half of those displaced, in other words, over 1/4 of the population of the country, have become refugees outside. Turkey remains by far the largest recipient of refugees from the Syrian conflict, with over 3 million estimated to be within the country's borders. It was in 2015, when the refugees started to move from Turkey into Europe in large numbers, however, that the world became fully aware of the plight of the refugees. The journey that the refugees undertook to reach Europe is perilous. These small boats in open sea waters, there's been significant casualties over the course of the refugee crisis. I'll come back to the numbers later, but it is extremely perilous journey. The death of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old child, captivated Canada and the world, and not to take away from his personal tragedy, but his death was only one of thousands throughout this period. In 2016, it was estimated that 1.5% of the refugees that sought to reach Europe from the Middle East and North Africa died on the journey. While a relatively small percentage, given that 360,000 people attempted the journey, this means over 5,000 people died. The numbers from this year actually appear to be worse. While we do not have complete data from this year, so far Amnesty estimates that the death rate of refugees attempting to reach Europe is 2.7%. The reason for the death rate increasing is that the EU's efforts to reassert border controls, while effective in reducing the absolute numbers, has paradoxically made the refugees' path more deadly. The journey was already perilous, traveling over mountains and deserts with limited food and water supplies and in poor conditions. The increased security, however, has made smugglers take increasingly risky routes, and with less caution, as people are willing to pay more for the restricted opportunities. In the first half of 2017, 2,253 people died trying to cross the Mediterranean, with a further 40 dying on the overland routes. Once the refugees arrived in Europe, they found that the relief they expected was not coming. The major point of entry for the refugees from Syria was Greece, which due to the financial crisis was not prepared for the influx. While the majority of refugees did not intend to remain in Greece, the country's inability to cope with such an influx meant that they were unable to regulate the tide of refugees entering and leaving the country. Furthermore, EU regulations made it Greece's responsibility to look after the refugees. The Dublin Agreement, which regulates refugees in the EU, states that the member country where refugees first arrive are responsible for their processing. Greece, in other words, was expected to shoulder the burden. Given their financial limitations, they were unable to do so, with refugees either being placed in poorly constructed camps or left to fend for themselves. As a result, groups of refugees were forced to make the arduous journey to other parts of Europe, most commonly Croatia, Hungary, and other Central European countries before claiming asylum. While Germany, the largest country in the EU, agreed to take in a significant number of refugees, 1.2 million in 2015-2016. Other European countries, most notably in the East, resisted efforts to accommodate the influx. This is probably the most visible example. This is the border between Hungary and Serbia, where Hungary has constructed a border fence in order to try to prevent the flow of refugees into the country. The influx of refugees aggravated existing structural tensions within the European Union. While the European Union had previously developed a cohesive policy for refugees, the aforementioned Dublin regulations, the fact that the southern European countries proved incapable of dealing with such an influx forced the European Union to develop ad hoc policy in order to address the issue. These ad hoc policies, however, have not been well received by all members of the European Union. In fact, the decision of the European Union to enforce refugee quotas upon its member states has been met by rising nationalist and populist responses throughout the European Union, but in particular Hungary and Slovakia. Both countries, on the front line of the refugee movement into the EU from Serbia, sought to challenge the EU ruling, but their case was dismissed in September 2017. Nevertheless, the populism that the refugee movement has helped generate in European countries shows no signs of abating. Hungary's Prime Minister went so far as to claim after the decision went against him, "This decision jeopardizes the security and future of all of Europe. Politics has raped European law and values," end quote. In framing politics in such a manner, it's clear that the refugee crisis has helped fuel European nationalist concerns that their continent is losing its historical and cultural identity. The rising nationalism caused by the refugee influx and the EU's lackluster response to these developments points to one of the consequences of unplanned migrations. The European countries' governments, and in particular Eastern European countries, many of which possess relatively small populations with declining birth rates, believe that the refugees represent an existential threat to their way of life. It is not only in the smaller European countries that this has proven to be an issue. In last month's elections in Germany, the Alternative for Germany party, AfD, a far right-wing political party that has been described in various newspapers as populist, extremist, and perhaps even neo-Nazi in nature, managed to acquire 12.6% of the popular vote and obtain a plurality in some of the Eastern German ridings. You can see here their percentage of their vote throughout Europe, with, in particular, their support being concentrated in what used to be Eastern Germany. Given that Germany under Angela Merkel has been at the forefront of progressive politics on integrating the refugees, this backlash shows that radical groups can use the innocuous policies to boost their radical position. The reason that the current refugee crisis, and in many ways Europe's failure to deal with it in an effective manner, is important is that climate change aggravated pre-existing social and political issues in the Mediterranean, and at a bare minimum will do so in the future. Climate change will disproportionately affect the developing world in terms of social disruption. With the majority of migrants coming to Europe from the Near East and Sub-Saharan Africa, environmental refugees will become a constant issue for Europe to deal with in the 21st century. Furthermore, sea level rises will strain the capacity of Mediterranean countries, both north and south, to deal with the influx of climate refugees. I will use Egypt as a case study for how social trends, political developments, and rising sea levels will combine to create the potential for vast numbers of refugees and population movements in the future. Egypt currently faces severe climate and political related challenges that will cause significant numbers of environmental refugees throughout the Mediterranean in the coming century. Currently, Egypt is a net recipient of refugees from Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular Somalia, due to the special relationship it has with the country from the early 20th century. Furthermore, it has become one of the major recipients of Syrian refugees since Europe has restricted their access, with over 50,000 arriving in the first half of 2017 alone. The future, however, will likely see these individuals pursue other avenues for settlement due to the structural and environmental issues that Egypt faces in the near future. There are two major problems that Egypt faces, both related to climate change, but one having political connotations as well. The first problem is that Egypt is highly dependent upon the River Nile for its water supply, with up to 97% of its water needs coming from the Nile. This resource, however, is nearly tapped, with Egyptians on average only receiving 660 cubic meters of water, down from 2,500 in 1947, and just about the 500 cubic meters, the standard definition for when a country reaches a severe water crisis. The reasons for this are twofold. First, Egypt's rising population having grown by 41% since 1990s, is significantly straining the country's infrastructure. Second, Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, while promising significant economic gains for Ethiopia, is causing a staggering reduction in the flow of water to the Nile Delta, as Ethiopian sources account for 70% of the Nile's flow. The second issue is that rising sea level in the Mediterranean, which magnifies the problem caused by the reduced flow of the Nile River. Egypt, as previously mentioned, is highly dependent on the Nile Delta for the majority of its food supplies, and also houses 39 million people. Unfortunately, it is likely to be the region of Egypt that is most adversely affected by rising sea levels. Based on conservative estimates for sea level rise in the Mediterranean, 1 meter, you see several different varied perspectives on how much the Mediterranean is going to rise over by 2100, ranging from 0.6 meters to 4.2, one being a fairly conservative number. Approximately 20% of the Nile Delta will be submerged by 2100. This sea level rise is compounded by the fact that the northern third of the delta is slowly sinking into the sea due to soil compacting. Furthermore, a further 13% of the Nile Delta will be rendered unsuitable for crops due to increased salination of the soil. Given that Egypt currently imports 50% of its food from elsewhere, including regions that are prone to crop failures brought on by climate change, as seen through 2006 or 2011, this strain will likely create further social unrest and cause people to look elsewhere. Furthermore, those refugees from sub-Saharan Africa who currently look to Egypt for a new life will look elsewhere. Europe will become all the more appealing. The current refugee crisis in the Mediterranean has raised significant issues in how Europe has approached the matter and raised lessons for how countries can approach it in the future. The current divides in the European Union, both economically and politically, have made its approach haphazard and exacerbated these tensions. Europe specifically, and the world more broadly, needs to learn these lessons that the unplanned migrations has taught them. Given the challenges faced by Europe in the current migration, whose numbers appear insignificant to the potential migrations it faces in the future, it would do well to learn from this event so that it and the world can prepare for the population movements brought on by rising sea levels. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm just wondering what Dr. Huck is he looking this way?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Where is the camera? Oops, sorry. Hi, Dr. Huck. Can you hear us?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can...
Wonderful. I'm going to introduce you. I'm standing here so you can see me, but I'm going to move so they can see me better. Hang on a sec. So it's a real honor to have Dr. Saleemul Huq with us today. Dr. Huq is an international expert on climate refugees and especially in Bangladesh, but throughout the developing world. And Dr. Huq joined the International Center for Climate Change and Development in 2009 as the director and is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development. He's an expert on the links between climate change and sustainable development, particularly from the perspective of developing countries. Dr. Huq was the lead author of the chapter on adaptation and sustainable development in the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also for the chapter on adaptation and mitigation in its fourth assessment report. So we quote him all the time. His research currently focuses on the least developed countries' vulnerability to climate change and the impact of adaptation measures. And we're very grateful to Dr. Huq for being here with us by video conference today. It's a bit later at night for him, so we really appreciate you joining us tonight, Dr. Huq. Thank you very much. And the audience can see you on a big screen, and you're looking through the camera straight at them looking at you. So please proceed.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good time. I just heard the previous presentation, and I'd like to thank Jamie for making that. What I propose to do is to take you through a little bit of the geography and the vulnerability of Bangladesh, specifically the the dangers of sea level rise in the low-lying coastal areas, which may lead to the forced displacement or migration of millions of people, perhaps 10 million plus people over time, and what the government and the people of Bangladesh are thinking of doing about the problem. I wouldn't say planning yet, but they're certainly thinking about it. And then I'll end by giving you an example of something that is unrelated to climate change per se, but it is certainly a significant migration problem, if not crisis, which is the forced movement of Rohingyas from the Rakhine state of Myanmar into Bangladesh. Currently, the numbers are in the order of 500,000 and rising. And I was able to visit that area recently and have a look at it. And I'll share a little bit about the plight of these people and what Bangladesh is doing to help them. So let me start by describing my country, Bangladesh. I apologize, I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to look at me. I hope it won't be too boring. The country of Bangladesh is a fairly small country. It's only 150,000 square kilometers. I'm not sure exactly which province of Canada that would be equivalent to, but it's a fairly small country. But it has a very large population of well over 150, probably in the order of 160 million people living in less than 150,000 square kilometers, which means that the population density of the entire country is well over 1,000 people per square kilometer, which, according to the United Nations, is the density of a city. So it gives you an idea of how densely populated the country is. It's also one of the poorest countries in the world. Although getting less poor over time, but nevertheless one of the poorest countries. And in the United Nations, the poor countries have a group of countries that they belong to. There are 48 of them. They're classified as the least developed countries, and Bangladesh is one of those. Most of the others are in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are a few in Asia, including Bangladesh. So Bangladesh, amongst the least developed countries, is the most populous of the least developed countries, and it's a member of that group. The group is important because in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the least developed countries negotiate as a group, as a bloc, being one of the most vulnerable and at the same time poorest sets of countries. We negotiate. I'm an advisor to the group of least developed countries, to the chair of the group, which is currently Ethiopia, and part of what I do is provide advice to them in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Conference of Parties. The next one, which is going to be the 23rd Conference of Parties, is coming up in a couple of weeks' time in Bonn, in Germany. So the country of Bangladesh, as I said, is already poor, already densely populated. Its geography is that it is located on the delta of three of the major rivers of the world, two of them being the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, which are very big rivers, two of the biggest rivers in the world that arise in the Himalayas. They pass through China, India, and Nepal, and then eventually come through Bangladesh into the Bay of Bengal. So the country of Bangladesh is located on the delta. There's a third river that's not that long. It arises from the foothills of the Himalayas. It's called the Meghna, and it enters into Bangladesh, into the northeastern part of the country. And all three rivers then merge in Bangladesh and flow into the Indian Ocean through the Bay of Bengal. So the country is very flat. It's basically the delta of these three major rivers, and it's prone to flooding every time, except the three rivers. We have floods. This year we had floods in the Meghna, early in the year in the northeast of the country, and then we had floods in the Ganges in the western part of the country a few months later. And this entire area is prone to flooding over time. What will happen with climate change is that the frequency of floods is likely to go up, and we are already seeing that in that what used to have, we have very good hydrological record from the British colonial period, and even before that, the Mughal period for several hundred years. There are records of the rivers, floods of the rivers, and typically what is called a 1 in 20-year flood, which describes the magnitude of a flood event, has come around every 20 years for several hundred years now. Almost like clockwork. Every 20 years we've had a 1 in 20-year flood. However, in the last 20 years we've had 5 of them, the last one being this year. So, although we can't attribute every single flood to human-induced climate change, what we can say under change, the hydrological patterns are changing, and that the intensive i.e. the higher frequency of 1 in 20-year events is a manifestation of that. In fact, flood this year is supposed to have been a 1 in 50-year event, so it's a much greater magnitude flood. And under climate change, the predictions from the climate scientists and the climate models are that what used to be a 1 in 20-year event may well become a 1 in 10 or even a 1 in 5-year event, and we need to be prepared for that. So that's with regard to flooding. But what I am going to talk to you about is with regard to another impact of climate change, which is sea level rise and associated cyclones that come in from the Bay of Bengal. With the predicted sea level rise due to climate change of anything up to a meter over the century, we will see many parts of very low-lying parts of the delta eventually get inundated by sea level rise, but in the meantime, we'll get salinized, gradual salinization. And we are seeing this already. In the coastal parts of Bangladesh, people are actually drinking saline water. And one of the interventions or adaptations is to provide people with fresh drinking water, help them harvest rainwater on their overhead tanks and then drink that during the dry season. And so we are already seeing the initial impacts of sea level rise, combined with intensification of cyclones. Again, the prediction from the climate scientists with regard to cyclones is not that the cyclones will get more frequent. In part of the world, in Bay of Bengal, we call them cyclones. In the Caribbean, they call them hurricanes, and in the Pacific, they call them typhoons. But they're all the same phenomena. These are storms that come in from the sea. They gather energy from the temperature of the sea, and then they hit land with devastating force, particularly winds and tidal waves. But the prediction from the climate change perspective is that the intensity of cyclones is likely to increase because the atmospheric temperature will be higher and the sea surface temperature will be higher. And as I said, the magnitude of cyclones was highly dependent on the sea surface temperature. You saw this, we all saw this happen in the last few weeks in the Caribbean when a succession of hurricanes, firstly Harvey hit Texas and Houston, then Irma hit Florida, Maria hit Puerto Rico, and then we even had one hit Ireland. The succession is unprecedented succession of very high intensity category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes is almost entirely due to the elevated temperatures in the Caribbean and the Atlantic this year. Relatively high temperatures of the ocean provide the energy for these cyclones to become more intense than they otherwise would have been. And we've seen that devastating effect even in the United States of America. And so Bangladesh is going to be affected by both cyclones and sea level rise over time, and that is going to contribute to significant numbers, anything plus or minus 10 million people eventually. By eventually, I mean the next 10, 20 years are going to have to move from coastal Bangladesh. At the moment, we already have a significant rate of rural to urban migration. People are moving for a variety of reasons, including environmental degradation in their homesteads and villages, and a large proportion, in fact, a disproportionate number of migrants go to Dhaka city. Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. It's the fastest growing megacity in the world. Current population is in the order of 15 million, and it really cannot absorb another 10 million people, which is what is projected to happen to occur over the next 2 decades if we aren't able to adapt where they are, and we aren't able to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and stem sea level rise in particular. So one of the things that the government and people in Bangladesh are thinking about is to cope with this migration of in the order of 10 million people over the next 10 to 20 years. We need to plan it. We need to ensure that they don't all end up in Dhaka city. So the thinking is a threefold strategy. The first element, or a three-legged stool if you like, the first leg of the stool is to immediately help people where they are. So the immediate task is to help people adapt to the conditions that they're facing at the moment. As I mentioned already, providing fresh drinking water, in terms of irrigation and cropping patterns. Our rice researchers and other crop researchers have already come up with a variety of rice varieties and other crops that can withstand higher salinity levels. And in fact, in the coastal area in Bangladesh, they're growing these saline-tolerant varieties of rice and then other crops. And then when they can't grow crops anymore, they grow shrimp and crabs and change the livelihood patterns. So Bangladeshis are actively adapting very, very fast, and I would say Bangladesh is one of the world leaders in adapting to the impacts of climate change. There's a limit to what you can adapt to. Just to give you an example of the rice varieties that are being developed, they can withstand, the new varieties can withstand 3 parts per trillion, or parts per thousand, or 5 or 6 or 7 parts per thousand, but the actual salinity levels are moving much faster than that. They're going up to 9 or 10 parts per thousand now in the coastal areas. So there is a limit to how much we can adapt up to, and we will reach those limits at certain times. So adaptation through technologies and other stopgap measures, they will help for a while, but they will not last forever. But the time period is very important, because what the time period allows us to do is to have a twin track policy. The first track being adaptation to help the people cope with the conditions that they're facing right now. And secondly, to provide education, skills, capacities building for the younger people, particularly young girls and boys, and particularly girls, to enable them to be able to get employment and jobs elsewhere and not have to grow up to become farmers and fishers like their parents, but be able to go and get better paying, better jobs in towns and cities, but at the same time ensure that they don't all end up in Dhaka, which means we have to create at least living conditions for 10 million people in about 10 or 12 other towns inland, not on the coast, where each town can absorb or can take on board another 1 million migrants from the coastal area. And so the strategy now is a combination of adaptation for the coastal people where they are now to be able to adapt to the conditions, education and skill building for the younger generation, and the creation of jobs and living conditions in a dozen different cities that can take roughly 1 million people each, and to make them into what are effectively migrant-friendly cities, to create those conditions for them to be able to move to. Now, what I've just described is not yet a proper plan. We haven't started investing in it, but it is the kind of thinking that we are coming up with, and we are trying to figure out now what the planning needed would be in order to make the right investments to make that happen, so that Bangladesh can cope with the flows of migrants that we anticipate will happen, and will not get them to become a crisis. So the idea is to plan the migration in a manner to assist and enable people to move at their own volition at their own timing, and in fact, indeed, to become economically better off after they've moved than they were where they were in the beginning. So in the climate change adaptation jargon, we call this transformative adaptation as opposed to simply risk management adaptation, which is what we are doing now, helping them in the coastal area. But if we can educate the children and the young kids and get them to get better jobs, both in Bangladesh and even abroad, then they will become economically better off, and they will we will have an example of what is adaptation. Let me just end by describing to you a condition that's happening in the coast in the southeastern part of Bangladesh on the border with Myanmar, or the country that used to be called Burma, where the regime there, the military regime, has for a long time treated the Muslim population in the state bordering Bangladesh, which is called Rakhine State, with extreme repression, and most recently has started a regime of ethnic cleansing. They are killing the young men, they are burning the villages, and they are encouraging them to flee the country and cross the border into Bangladesh. And within the last few months, we have had roughly 500,000 of these people come across the border, and they're still coming across in the thousands every day. The regime in Myanmar is extremely brutal. They are treating these people as foreigners and trying to throw them out. The government of Bangladesh is somehow managing to cope. I visited that area recently to have a look at it, and conditions are extremely dire. People, very interesting graphic about people, some with their mother, there's no parents, so there's a large proportion of orphans. Very few young men, some elderly men, but very few young men, and a significant number of pregnant young women as well. So the demographic is a very peculiar demographic of very young babies and children and young women predominating, with a few elderly men and very, very few young men in there. And we have to look after them. The government, the UN agencies, everybody is struggling to provide them with shelter, provide them with food, provide them with medical assistance, and it's not in the beginning it was sort of sorted things out. The UN agencies are helping these people, but it is a crisis. As a significant environment in that area, the places that they are housed in are forest lands. They've completely decimated the forest. There's some wild elephants in the area. Some of the people are trampled because they've been living on the trails of the wild elephants. It's a very unsatisfactory, a very difficult condition. This is not attributable to climate change. This is attributable to human, if you like, politics on the side of Myanmar. But the consequences are that we are now having to deal with and look after 500,000 people. Bangladesh is stepping up. We're doing what we can to help them. The Prime Minister has said that, if we can feed 160 million people, we can share our food with another 500,000 people. And we are indeed doing that. We're looking after them as best we can. But it requires a longer term planning, what we're going to do with them. We still haven't worked things out. The government is hopeful they'll go back, but that, to many people, including myself, is an unrealistic political scenario. It's unlikely that Myanmar will take them back, so we may have to think about dealing with them. So another 500,000 young little babies and children are going to have to be looked after by Bangladesh as we go forward. So a poor country, a vulnerable country to climate change, suffering its own problems, particularly sea level rise in the coastal area, we now are saddled with an additional population that we are going to have to look after. We will do our best to do that, but it's not something that's going to be easy for us to do. But let me end on a more optimistic note. In my view, Bangladesh, poor and vulnerable as it is also one of the most resilient countries. The people of Bangladesh are hardened, they are used to facing adversity, they are able to come up with solutions and deal with them. I'm not trying to sugarcoat the problems, but I am saying that the people are our biggest asset. And as I said, if we focus on younger people and educate them and enable them, then they can in turn become major from a problem to a solution. They can help Bangladesh solve its problems. Indeed, they can even help the rest of the world solve the problem of tackling climate change, because Bangladesh is far and away one of the most vulnerable and also far and away one of the most active countries in tackling climate change. And there's much that we can share with the rest of the world on how to tackle the impacts of climate change. Maybe I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Dr. Huck, are you okay to stay with us while we have Anna's talk and then
Sure.
join in the dialogue after that? If you have
Sure.
to go now, then we can do questions now. What works best for you?
Well, if you wouldn't mind doing them now, maybe a few minutes.
Yeah, sure. Shall we? Questions? Comments for Dr.
My question is, you talked about salination at the Delta and how that is being treated with crops like the rice. And are you talking about the salt coming from the sea through the rains falling down onto the crops, or are you talking about the sea level bringing in a higher salt content? Can we clarify that?
Sure. So I mentioned that we are on a delta, so we have these major rivers. And what we have is we have seasonal flooding. So part of the year we get very heavy rainfall. We call them the monsoons. And the river water fresh water flushes everything up. It goes out into the sea, and the entire fresh water for industrial boiler period. However, once the rivers start receding and the monsoons stop, the river flows start decreasing, and in particular this is true for the Ganges River, which I mentioned, which is flowing through the western side of Bangladesh. Because the Ganges flows through India for about 2,000 kilometers, and during that long journey through India, it gets diverted. The Indians have a number of cities that use it, and water, irrigation. They have a dam just upstream of Bangladesh at a place called Farakka, where they, during the dry season, they divert water that would otherwise come to Bangladesh to go to Calcutta and flush the of Calcutta. And for many years, this was a bone of contention between the two countries. We've recently had a water sharing treaty where we share the water. Essentially, neither side gets as much as it wants, but at least we share the most critical lean period, which is just for a couple of months around April and May. So the salinity problem is seasonal problem. The river flow is at its lowest, and the sea levels keep creeping in. The saline water from the sea creeps upstream, and these are tidal rivers. So the tide comes in, brings saline water with it. It causes salinity to creep into the land, and as I said, crops that are not saline tolerant are affected and aren't able to grow. So we have to grow, develop saline tolerant crops which can withstand these higher levels of salinity. Now, one other thing to note is that our particular fish is a mangrove forest. It's the world's biggest mangrove forest called the Sundarbans. And the Sundari trees, the Sundari trees, which are the species of trees that give the forest their name, are being affected. And these are natural ecosystems. There's not much we can do to change them. They are being affected already. And we have a phenomenon called top dying of these trees, which are being affected by much higher. The mangrove forest species are generally salt-tolerant species. That's where they grow. They grow in saline conditions. But when the salinity increases above certain thresholds, then even those species can't survive. And in the Sundarbans, we are seeing this phenomenon of so they shift, but trees also we're sick. So it's mainly sea level dry season when the rivers river flow than they are during. Any other questions?
Sorry about that.
Dr. Hug, you've described a very dire current and future situation for your country. My question is, what can the rest of the world do to help, particularly a country like Canada? How should we be thinking about this?
Well, I have two, maybe three answers to your question. The first one is to emphasize that this is a global problem. Nations of access are caused by all of us. You in Canada, we but in Canada produced a disproportionately high problem. And therefore, I would argue you have a great response. Are due to lifestyles, the way you travel, the way you wear clothes, the food you eat. If you eat more meat, then you have a bigger carbon footprint than if you're a vegetarian. Your lifestyle does matter. So think about that. See ways in which you think you'll be able to decrease your emissions, get your action to implement the agreements that we already have. We have something called the Paris Agreement on climate change, to which Canada has signed up. You must make your government hold to their promises there. And then finally, with regard to what you can do for us in Bangladesh, I would say you should have it the fact that you sign contact look up my and the things we do quite a lot of it. Either you or people who might be interested, but they usually PhD students, university and get to know us better. And so what we need to do is see this as a common global problem and find ways in which we can help each other. You will also be affected in Canada. You will not climate change. And you may well be able to learn from Bangladesh, because we are having the problem which may at some point also hit you. So it's a mutually reinforcing exchange of knowledge and abilities to tackle climate change, which I umbrella of expression solidarity It's a global problem. We're all global citizens. We need to learn from each other, and we need to to tackle what is a planetary problem. It's not a Canadian problem. It's not a Bangladeshi problem. It's a problem of everybody on planet Earth.
Thank you, Dr. Huck. We're having a few technical issues, and I know people really want to hear what you are saying. So I'm just going to ask maybe the things that you just said that we could do. We didn't hear very well the last thing that you said. So what I would like to ask is maybe if you could just put a few notes in an email to me, and I can send your message out to everybody that's here, because we have everybody's email address. And that way,
I'd be happy to do that.
That would be really helpful. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to move on with Anna's presentation. And Dr. Huck, are you able to stay on for a bit of dialogue? Or are you going to bed now?
I'm afraid not, if you don't mind.
No. Well, we very much appreciate you being here. So I guess as Dr. Huck sorry about the technical issues. This is what happens when you're trying to cut down your emissions and you don't fly people. We've just got to get much better technology, and if I was an entrepreneur, I'd probably be working on holographic representation of speakers right now. So I'm going to introduce our third panelist, Anna Zhuo. Anna is a co-founder of the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project, a non-profit organization, and working on something that Dr. Huck talked about, which I thought was just a really inspiring point that he was making, that we have to help cities become places that can welcome refugees. So that's what Anna's working on increasing capacity for urban resilience and planning in the face of climate change and global migration. Anna's from Vancouver and has a master's in community and regional planning from the UBC School of what's Scott's Community and Regional Planning, that's the one. I was thinking with the acronym, so I never think of what it actually means. Her experience as part of an immigrant family and involvement with the temporary resettlement of a refugee family drives her interest in advancing settlement and integration planning in Canada, and Anna recently attended the Habitat 3 conference in Quito as part of the Canadian delegation. Anna's multidisciplinary interests stem from her academic background in science and psychology, in addition to work experiences in health geography research, campus planning and sustainability, and urban development research on implementation challenges. So really excited to welcome Anna, and looking forward to your talk. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you to the gentleman over here who asked such a relevant question to what I'm about to talk about. It is quite daunting of a task to think about how we're going to deal with all the migration that's going to happen due to climate change. And so what really inspired our project to form and be founded was kind of seeing how the Syrian refugee crisis unfolded, and realizing that a lot of the decisions are being made at the federal level, and in terms of the allocation of refugees that come into our country, the cities are basically told, you have to accept and absorb a certain number of refugees, and yet those decision-making and service provision decisions, I guess, are being made at the federal and provincial level. So what we really wanted to do was to start thinking about how cities can become more of a proactive and active stakeholder at the table in terms of understanding what the municipal role is in preparing receiving cities, as we want to call them, for climate migration and resettlement. So our mission is to develop resources for cities and urban planners to respond to the challenge of climate change displacement and resettlement. We're working with a number of partners, including ACT from SFU, on several grants and project funding opportunities to start developing these resources that we're brainstorming that we can provide to cities, and to do the research that's necessary to provide data-driven tools that can be used to advocate for the resources that we need. Our process that we've chosen to undertake involves initiating and facilitating dialogue between practitioners, academics, migrant and refugee community members, students, and decision makers to generate ideas and to start brainstorming some policy suggestions. Then, two, we'd like to continuously return to community stakeholders to refine these policy ideas, initiate micro-scale pilot programs to build local capacity for effective resettlement, and to undertake further research. The kind of culminating ideal at the end is to provide local governments and other bodies such as professional associations with decision-making tools, best practices, recommendations, and that data-driven research that we've been talking about to support the efforts assisting climate migrants and refugees. Oh, I need to remember to click this. So I'll let you just read through that really quickly. I just went over that as well. So what we've heard so far has focused on the places where people will be vulnerable to displacement. The challenge that we want to tackle now at CMRP is preparing for when people arrive. Canada in general has expressed a lot of political drive in accepting responsibility for taking on such a crisis, and so we want to be able to be prepared for future influxes of migrants and refugees due to climate change. This map represents a visual of the areas that are most likely to be impacted by climate-related disruptions, such as the deltas and small islands and coastlines that have been mentioned earlier tonight in blue, areas exposed to desertification and drought in yellow, areas exposed to hurricanes in that purpley color, and Arctic areas vulnerable to ice and permafrost melting in the green up there. So as you can see, Bangladesh and other very populous countries are the most threatened, but on our continent, we can see that we're actually quite vulnerable to permafrost melting in the Arctic, drought, and hurricanes as well. So we can start to see the colored areas of this map being as where people are going to move from, and the gray areas, like where we stand, as areas where it might be safe and secure to move to. A report by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees in 2016 revealed that out of the total number of 240 million international migrants, 65.6 million were forcibly displaced, which means they've had to flee their homes involuntarily and unexpectedly. 90% of all Canadian immigrants have chosen to settle in urban areas. So as migration, global migration, becomes a key feature of our globalized world, urban areas become increasingly important stakeholders. Cities are at the forefront of the challenges of global migration, but they are also well placed to deliver the solutions that benefit both existing and new residents. So we've kind of touched on this a little bit, Deb mentioned, but we all kind of understand the process of climate change, right? That, you know, the release of too many GHGs in our atmosphere creates climate change, resulting in a wide range of impacts, as we can see here. Oh man. Oh boy. I'm going to hold this so I don't forget. Cities are becoming strong leaders in incorporating climate mitigation strategies into the scope of their work. Vancouver is a great example, with the work being done as part of the Greenest City Action Plan. And urban resilience planning has also taken off, and it's established some strong footing in addressing the social and physical challenges due to climate impacts. Our work really wants to draw attention to some of these second and third order impacts, particularly to the actions and strategies that are needed to address social and physical planning challenges around migrant and refugee resettlement in relatively safe places like the Lower Mainland, like I mentioned. Currently, the bulk of our support system available to newcomers are housed by service agencies such as the ISS of BC, Mosaic, other not-for-profit organizations providing support and sponsorship opportunities, religious and cultural associations, in some cases through local immigration partnerships such as the Surrey or Vancouver LIP. They provide information and resources as well as ongoing policy and planning research to support the creation of immigrant and refugee strategic plans. A great example of ongoing work in Vancouver is the ISS of BC Welcome House pictured here, which really brings together the service provision in the most cohesive and efficient way possible, bringing everything into one building. And that's really one of the leading practices that we can see. But this is not enough on its own. A lot of the biggest challenges that refugees and newcomers face, especially when they come in large numbers, are not able to be solved by providing these services and middleman services. As I'll explain later on, a lot of these actually have to do with urban development challenges. In a country of immigrants like Canada, we all know that there's benefits to a diverse community, and we're aware of what can happen when support systems collapse. We can see examples from all over the world that insufficient support and lack of planning for migrants and refugees in cities can result in fragmentation, overcapacity, overcrowding, massive inequalities, homelessness, the list goes on. But really, Dr. Huck mentioned this, but the goal is to take this challenge and put it into an opportunity for economies within Canada to make use of the human capacity that can come with population influxes, and to have that cultural richness and the diversity and multiculturalism and all of the positive aspects that come with it. So what we've seen, not just here but around the world, is that we have a tendency to deliver really strong emergency response mechanisms and the settlement services to meet the basic needs of refugees and migrants that are coming to the city. What is actually most challenging is progressing from that second step to the third, to really make sure that we're focusing on long-term integration. What we've learned from past experiences like the Syrian refugee influx is that the capacity of our resettlement system is not sufficient, and that some of those biggest challenges can't be solved. And so I like to tell a story about, and I think it's an anecdote that really sums it up really well. When I attended the Habitat 3 conference on sustainable urban development and housing in Quito, Ecuador last year, I heard the Minister of Public Works and Housing from the Kingdom of Jordan speak at length about the challenges they faced in taking in huge numbers of Syrian refugees over a very small time period. He said that the biggest problem was that funding for a lot of this kind of relief from the UN or the Red Cross were often earmarked for providing these kind of basic support systems that you can see on the first couple columns. But really what was needed over time was funding for urban development, because their sewage systems were used over capacity. They had a huge shortage of housing units for permanent housing. They didn't have enough school facilities to be able to educate all of the children that were coming in. So all of these are really things that were sorely needed in the long run, but they had trouble trying to get funding from the international community and from their federal government to be able to address these needs. So how do we anticipate for future stressors when we plan for growth and development? Housing, infrastructure, the economy, and the environment are large-scale and long-term challenges that can't really be tackled overnight. How do we engage with long-range planning when it's difficult to predict future influxes of climate migrants and refugees, and let alone where they might be coming from and what kind of demographic? Current growth strategies and forecasting models, such as those in the Metro Vancouver 2040 growth strategy, use backcasted immigration rates, and climate change displacement is not really yet integrated into any of these population projections or models. This is the model that is feeding in and setting these targets for municipalities in Metro Vancouver now in dealing with their long-range planning. So you can see the conundrum. In order for funding to be properly distributed for cities to act with foresight, they need clear targets that are data-driven and to meaningfully undertake this work. But where, as of right now, it's really difficult to do this forecasting with a lot of accuracy. So, in anticipating the kind of migrants or refugees that might end up in a certain region, and the kinds of supports that might be necessary to accommodate them, it's helpful to start thinking about the nature of the displacement and resettlement needs that may arise that would cause people to move here in the first place. Of course, these relationships are far more complex than what I'm depicting here in this small graph, small table, but it's a good starting point, and it helps us think about the when and the who of the challenge. The Climate and Migration Coalition out of the UK have been looking into the patterns of human movement caused by climate change disruptions, and their observations from examples and testimonies from around the world has begun to inform the nature and characteristics of these different patterns. So if you want to look, if we look at disasters in two different categories, we can see that rapid onset disasters such as hurricanes, flooding, typhoons, forest fires like we've seen in BC, and earthquakes, they're most likely to cause internal and temporary displacement, which means people are not crossing borders. It's unexpected, unplanned, and the displacement is involuntary. There's a lack of agency in relocation because oftentimes there's tremendous loss of assets, and there's this desire to return to their original home if possible. And if you compare this to slow onset disasters such as drought, desertification, permafrost and erosion, sea level rise, climate-induced conflicts, these often result in international or cross-border displacements. The drivers of migration are often multifaceted. It could be a combination, like in Syria, a combination of conflict, climate-related drought, and poverty in some other cases. In areas like, say, for example, Mexico, where the agriculture is no longer arable, you can see a lot of circular migration of people who go to other places for work, for economic opportunities when it's less viable at a certain time of year. So you've got some seasonal migration. And this slow onset disasters often result in permanent resettlement as well. Dr. Huck talked about planned relocation as a method of adaptation, and this offers the displaced peoples with some level of agency and choice in terms of deciding when and where and how they would get somewhere else, and a diverse range of capacity and assets. You could have the poorest of the poor moving to a different country under refugee status, or you could have someone who's quite wealthy and they're able and they have the assets to be able to emigrate and seek opportunities abroad. So if you start to look at it under these different categories, even if you take say the Lower Mainland or Canada as an example, the rapid onset disasters and people that are coming due to those displacements are likely to be from Canada or from North America, We talked about the Arctic communities, the northern communities that have to relocate because of erosion and permafrost melting. The BC wildfires, as we've seen this year, has caused a ton of displacement. So we can start to anticipate where people might be coming from. In terms of slow onset disasters, that's a little bit less predictable because they can be coming from elsewhere. But it's important to note that not everyone is going to be labeled a climate change refugee or an environmental migrant. A lot of this language is not yet in the international policies around managing refugee and migrant flows. So, but if we can start thinking about the causes and effects, we can potentially do a better job with forecasting the needs that may arise in the future. So what we can do is the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project, our goal is really to integrate migration and resettlement work into urban resilience planning. Like the 100 Resilient Cities organization, as well as part of our overall response to climate change. So we've started to speak with cities around the Lower Mainland, and there have been a few that have been very, very forward and forthcoming with looking to collaborate with us to see what the next steps in Vancouver could be. Population influxes must start to be seen as a potential stressor to the urban system, and proactive actions need to be taken to mitigate and adapt. To do so, we need to start by creating platforms for multi-sectoral dialogue, stakeholder feedback, and creating tangible and data-driven tools for cities to leverage and begin advocating for the resources we need to plan for this challenge in the future. So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you in the question period.
Thanks so much, Anna. Thank you. Yeah, so we're going to have a bit of, we'd love to hear some questions, ideas, concerns, thoughts from you all, and we've got, so Jamie and Anna have really presented, along with Dr. Huck, a really interesting layers of perspectives here, because Jamie's looking at the international impacts. Dr. Huck has given us a specific example of a developing country that is facing some major challenges, and Anna has talked about how we can handle this on the ground. So we'd be really interested in hearing what you and the audience think. Maybe we could get a bit more light too. I feel like we're in the dark here. Can we ask can we put the lights up? Just so nobody can see. Okay, so questions, comments from you guys. See a hand here. Laurie, there's a hand right there.
Thank you very much. I'm Zafar Adil. I'm the Executive Director for Pacific Water Research Center at Simon Fraser University. So thank you very much for all three talks. What really struck me the most was the human side of this whole situation that we're facing, and I think some of the consequences for people, families, for children and women, they're really gut-wrenching. So thank you for presenting that human side of the picture as well. I have a question which I think is mostly directed towards Jamie, but perhaps Anna can answer too. I think the kind of responses that we're discussing here today in terms of preparing for, whether in cities or in countries which are receiving migrants, long-term planning, emergency planning, etc. But I think there's an underlying assumption that migration is inevitable. And I would like to challenge you a little bit on that, because migration is not just driven by sea level rise or climate change impacts, it's also social and economic. And it has severe consequences for those who move, where they move, etc. There are ways in which you can help countries, help people, help communities build a better future for where they are. And countries like Canada can play a role in getting there. So my question is, and while we talk about projections of how many millions of people will be on the move, is that really inevitable, and how do we sort of change that equation and think a little bit differently for a different outcome?
No, great question. It's one of the reasons I try to avoid dealing specifically with numbers, with projections for the future, is you often see the numbers, they get so increasingly large numbers, as you mentioned, 350 million, I believe was about 2050. Well, it's not necessarily inevitable per se, like the numbers that are coming up. Based off some of the socioeconomic conditions in the region, the environment acts as a stressor. And based off the current state structure within, say, the Near East, also in Southeastern Europe, you can say with a fair degree of certainty that there is going to be refugees start to emerge. In terms of what necessarily can be done, one of the major aspects is international aid and development programs to try to help countries that are most going to be affected. A lot of times countries, there tends to be backlash against development projects within Canada. We saw this as recently as 10 years ago in terms of international aid Canada was committing. We see that in the United States as well today. Could everybody hear me in the back beforehand, hopefully? Damn. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll go back a little bit. That's okay. So one of the major issues that we face with the projections is, as you mentioned, there's not necessarily, the number of projections tend to be given or taken as a given. There is certain things that we can certainly do as countries, Canada, increasing international development aid to assist countries to improve conditions so that there isn't necessarily the need to migrate in significant numbers as are projected. That said, aid tends to be incredibly politicized within a lot of the countries that are dealing with. Canada was up until 10 years ago. We saw recently within the United States, President Trump's effort to call back international aid, cut back the funding to United Nations, for example. We also see it in Europe today, where increasingly, with some of the populism brought on through the refugee movement, although there were social and cultural dynamics that were already at work, this has aggravated and caused further decline of international aid, which in many ways is actually fueling the problem that they're trying to prevent. So, to your question, I understand we don't want to necessarily agree that there's going to be inevitable numbers emerging, although climate change will act as a stressor that will cause refugees. It's just that numbers are what we're going to end up debating, I find in many sense. Does that make sense or answer your question?
Yeah, I saw the movie Human Flow, the Vancouver Film Festival. Great film. It illustrated a lot of the, issues around, migrant flows around Europe and globally. And it does seem to be a global problem. I was wondering if there's any movement toward an international convention that would start to perhaps, allocate migrants to different countries around the world, because, for example, as Jamie described in Europe, it doesn't seem like a long-term workable solution. In the Human Flow movie, it shows migrants backing up against the fence between Greece and Macedonia, and then struggling to find a way out and around the fence, and doesn't seem to be really a cohesive approach to dealing with the situation.
Okay, can people in the back hear? You could hear that? Okay. Anna, do you? Okay.
No, one of the major problems is there really isn't kind of an international cohesive approach to this. It's something that we're going to have to consider in the future. The problem is that, as we witness within the EU, it's likely to be incredibly politicized. It's also taking away much of the agency from the refugees themselves, where they're being forced to settle. This has actually been one of the points that within Eastern European countries have used to particularly counter the refugee quotas, arguing that we bring in the refugees, but they'll end up moving to, say, Germany, Austria, elsewhere. That said, they're using this argument for very much political purposes because they don't want to intake refugees. But it shows there is a point in that many of the refugees have been denied agency throughout the whole process. So it's continuing kind of taking away their agency as they continue throughout to their eventual place of settlement. Taking that away is one of the major problems that we're facing in terms of where we're going to deal with most of the refugees ending up in the world, because there has to be some decision making brought on by the refugees themselves where it'll end up. We can't just completely strip it away. Quota systems have a tendency of backfiring in respects.
Yes, hi, I'm Warren McKay. This is directed to Anna. I enjoyed your presentation a lot. You talked near the end about resiliency. And the common approach to resiliency is just to have excess capacity. And so what I'm thinking about that then is in an environment in North America where we are driven by efficiency, i.e. not excess capacity, is that the discussion you're having? Is that we should have excess capacity in all of these things so that we can accept these immigrants and move culturally away from an efficiency culture?
That's a good question. I think some of the initial conversations that we've had does revolve around capacity. And one of the first steps that we see as a potential baby step into understanding this topic is developing a framework for capacity assessment within our cities. A capacity assessment of our land uses. What is our current capacity with regard to housing, obviously, but with schools, like for example, the Vancouver School Board, the lands that they own, some of them aren't actually developed into schools yet. And so what is that existing capacity that is possible? And I think we haven't really gotten to the step that you're talking about yet, but if I can kind of answer from my own thoughts.
The meeting has ended because it had only one participant for the last 30 minutes.
I think how I like to think about building capacity is not necessarily in terms of volume. And we really do need to, well, especially in the Lower Mainland where we're strapped for land, and there's no way we can actually increase the volume of our land. So I think a lot of our discussion is going to be revolved around, how can we change the way that we use our land to make it more efficient and to make it more adaptable to change, because we can't predict what's going to happen in the future. So to take housing as an example, the adaptability and flexibility of our housing units is going to be key to be able to accommodate a wide range of demographics. The biggest challenge I think Syrian families were facing when they came to Vancouver was that they couldn't find anything more than 2-bedroom houses or 3-bedroom units when their family sizes were 8 to 10. So I think that is a really good example of how we need to start thinking about adaptability and flexibility in terms of addressing our capacity and building capacity into the future.
There's no denying the trauma and the experiences and the tragedy of refugees of any kind, in particular climate refugees. However, on the other side of things, there's also they also bring an enormous amount of talent, experience, wisdom, and cultural inheritances that the rest of the world in situ can benefit from. And so my question is, what kind of backgrounds and education or experiences, these sort of things, are all of these people bringing along with them? And how do we, as Canadians here, be able to find ways to encourage them or to access all of that talent and power that comes with all of these people?
Sure. I think it's not working at all. Raise up. Hello? Okay. I think the what you're mentioning is this kind of, how do we make sure we can kind of take advantage of, in a positive way, the knowledge and the skill sets and the diversity of experiences that come with the human capital, I guess, coming in as migrants and refugees. I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of migrants that come here is that a lot of their certification or their what's the word I'm looking for? Qualifications. A lot of their qualifications are not valid or recognized in Canada, and I think that's an area where we can make a lot of progress, is to start looking at, you know, what are the resources, the human resources that are most valuable to Canada's economic needs, as well as, you know, what are the skill sets that Canada does not have that people are bringing with them from abroad, and to start creating a framework for making that transition a little bit easier, instead of having someone waste another 4 years trying to get the same degree they had before they got here. So I think that's something that can be done at a provincial or federal level that would be quite helpful for a lot of migrants that are coming here and struggling to find a job. Do you have any other thoughts?
I can speak a bit from the European context, and one of the issues that they're having to deal with is specifically in processing the number of refugees, particularly large numbers of refugees. One of the major hurdles that they have, for example, the refugees from 2015, still over half of them have yet to receive a decision on their refugee status. So, and that's not including those that arrived in 2016, 2017. In particular, refugees not from the major countries such as Syria, Iraq, Libya are the major three that are relatively processed relatively quickly. So there needs to be additional resources committed to ensure that there's a rapid transition possible, as opposed to the delayed process that is really not only squandering people's lives by having them stuck in an interregnum, but also squandering potential resources that you mentioned that can be incorporated into the countries of residence.
If I can just add another thought to that. Canada, in our immigration policy, is really, immigration is going to be a big part of our population growth, or at least to keep our population at a certain level, and it's going to become a big benefit for our economy. And something that I've heard through the grapevine is that rural decline is one of the hot topics in terms of immigration, and what are we doing with our rural economies and human capital that's flowing more and more from the rural to the urban, and how are we going to have that food security that we need in our agricultural industry that's on the decline as well. Well, maybe not the agricultural industry in general, but I think that's a major concern, and I think something that could be looked into is, if people are coming from areas where they have farming backgrounds, agricultural backgrounds, to create those opportunities for them to have access to land or to have access to employment on rural lands. But I guess the catch to that is that a lot of the immigration services are in urban areas. So I think something that urban planners might need to think about in the future is creating more urban-rural linkages, whether it's transportation, whether it's the connections between industries. I think that's going to be really key if rural decline and rural economies are to be a priority for Canada. Is there another question?
Hi there. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I'm curious about how your reaction would be, I think, towards my very first meeting of a climate refugee. It was actually in a talk that I was giving. And a person spoke up and talked about how he was a climate refugee. And I was like, so where did you come from? And he said, Michigan. He was there because the summers in the Midwest in the United States were getting far too hot for them. And you remember the killer summers that were happening in Chicago, that he was looking for a place that was by far more hospitable, that was Vancouver. And I'm curious, how do you engage the issue of climate refugees, whereby you have a market sorting system through which those who, well, can afford it are probably those who are most capable of becoming migrating due to declining climate situations and environmental qualities. And how do you balance that off with those who really have no means very low resources relative to those who can afford to move?
Well, I think he would be classed as a migrant, not a refugee. You know, I mean, there's voluntary migration. People do that all the time.
But when does voluntary become involuntary?
Yeah, exactly. And then when I think it's involuntary, then we get into refugee. But of course, we don't have that designation under the UN yet of climate refugee. I think it's possible that in our affluent situation, we are first of all. I mean, obviously, people are having trouble affording housing in Vancouver. So, if you can afford to move here, then you're obviously a very privileged person. But it really struck me that what Dr. Hutt talked about in terms of 500,000 people coming into Bangladesh in state of utterly dire need. Bangladesh, actually, I looked it up after he talked, it fits into BC 6.5 times. So 500,000 people moved into an area that already has 150 million people in it, that's sixth the size of British Columbia. And their attitude is, we're going to help them. And I think that, one of the things that we talk about in climate change adaptation is something called adaptive capacity. So vulnerability is based on three things. Vulnerability sounds like a simple thing. Are you in the way? Well, that's only one kind of vulnerability. There's sensitivity. How quickly can you get back up if you're knocked down? And then there's adaptive capacity. What networks do you have? How much money have you got? And what we find actually ironically is that often the poorer people have better social networks. It doesn't mean their capacity is higher, but it means that they're better, in one way it does, they are better connected. They're more likely to go around to a neighbor's house with water or a cup of sugar than your rich guy on the hill in his castle, which is us here at Vancouver. The question sort of arises is, and Dr. Hutt gave us a bit of a moral imperative there. Unfortunately, the technical glitches were obscuring his wisdom, but hopefully he'll send us it all in an email. But one of the things he was trying to say was, we here in North America are the highest per capita emitters. Us Canadians with the greenest city, we're still walking around emitting, I don't know what the percentage more is than people in Bangladesh, but we're emitting it, it's affecting them, they're not emitting it, they're being affected. And when you take decisions like Donald Trump withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, we're hearing a lot about how states are saying, oh, well, we'll pick up the slack on emissions. Well, that's not all the Paris Agreement entails for the U.S. The U.S. was putting $3 billion into the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to be helping developing countries which are being affected by our emissions adapt. And without that support, there is less likelihood that they would be able to do that with dignity. So, it comes back to, if you're from Michigan and you can move here, then you're a privileged person. But it speaks to, in our very backyard, we ourselves are going to come under that pressure and already are. I mean, look at California right now, like whole areas just burned to a crisp. Fort McMurray recently, Harvey, Hurricane Harvey, and the damage that's done. So how do we prioritize between who we help and how we make room for this? When we're having trouble housing ourselves, I mean, people affording it, and yet we are extremely privileged, and it means that we're probably going to try and guard what we've got more assiduously, perhaps, unless we really start thinking about it in a way that is altruistic. So that was a long rant.
Can I just expand on that? I think.
Oh, we need a microphone, otherwise no one.
Okay, I can speak up.
Yeah. And then I think next to you, jump.
Okay. Just to expand on that, I think one of the things that we as a country have to be very careful of is that the people who we bring here, and what I'm saying by that is, if we take a policy where we are stripping the capital, both the intellectual and monetary capital, out of a country, and only leaving the poor people the poorest of the poor in that country so they cannot recover, we are not doing anybody any favors. And I think we have to be very careful about the kind of people, you know, with this idea of who do you bring in, and do we bring in people that are helpful to Canada. This is not the direction that we should be thinking at all. We should be thinking about that country, because if we take it about how it's going to be good for Canada, I think we're going to make the wrong decisions here.
Thank you for that.
More on capacity, and I like the discussion on adaptive capacity. A month ago here, there was discussion of government capacity to bring all of these different issues together. And one of the remarks was, there's nobody to go and talk to. That the whole integration of government is something which really has to have attention. And how you do that, I'm not suggesting, but I just think that's underlying the whole thing. But we have a great capacity to belittle problems that don't affect us, we think. And we saw on one of the screens the concern that food production would go down because of climate change. But people who don't like that say, no it won't, it's going to get warmer, and warmth is good for growing, and so on we go. And by the way, look at all of these intense greenhouse food growing operations that are going to produce far more food than ever was produced in something of the same area. So it's just part of the noise that confuses what needs to be a clear message is what is the magnitude of the problem. And we might think we've had a series of teachable moments recently, but we've also had a series of denial moments.
I'd say one of the issues we face is we have this constant, still even remaining this kind of positivism where we can constantly assume that we're going to be able to overcome the problem 5, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. We don't have to do anything right now. It'll be solved eventually by some kind of future development, some magic bullet that will solve the problems. In the case of climate change, it's starting to lead the wagons already left the stable. You can't really assume that there's going to be some magic bullet. There's a certain momentum behind it that even if we immediately cut off our emissions, there's still going to be continual progress on climate change based off the pre-existing emissions. So you're right, we need to start taking a much more longer-term perspective with it. The problem is, especially with the current political system that emphasizes elections every 4 years, every 6 years, every 2 years in the case of the U.S. House of Representatives, there really isn't that kind of long-term perspective that exists in too many governments in the world, at least from what I've been studying and encountered.
Yeah, I think our political system is set up for short-term electoral terms, right? So if you're in power for 4 years, in that time you want to have visible achievements that will get you re-elected. And that's, you know, it's hard for decision makers because they are constrained by that on some level, right? They've got to maintain their popularity. And unfortunately, I think that short-term mentality is translating into the kind of the rise of populism that we're seeing. And there is a fear at the UN level that what we think of as adaptation, in my mind, is a very positive thing because, you know, we can look into the future and say, look, we know sea level rise is locked in now. Like, that is one thing that is projected to simply now, it's going to keep rising. We've altered the climate irrevocably. You know, that there's nothing... that we're going to actually build walls around the countries that have the capacity to do that because we're going to try and protect what we've got. And so we have to decide early on in the game if we want to be helpful to others. And we kind of have to start living by values, I think, and really trying to talk from there and resisting the tide of populism and of self-focus. But that's a very idealistic thing to say, I know. But I'm going to guess a lot of people do feel that way. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to call out to what you're saying there, Deb, I think my name is George Benson. I'm a co-founder of the Climate Migrants Refugees Project with Anna. We recently did a workshop in Seattle, and I had a gentleman come up to me and Anna after the workshop, and he was saying, so I come from a very small rural community in eastern Washington state. We're a Republican county through and through and through and through. You cannot find a place that's redder than us. I cannot categorically talk about the idea of climate change, migrants, refugees with the people that I work for. They will completely reject it out of hand. And I said, that seems to make sense. I can believe that is probably the situation you find yourself in. One of the ways, and I think it weaves through this conversation about human capital and capacity, is one of the ways in which we can start to broach that and already address this, we're talking about rural population growth and decline, is looking for co-benefits. And I completely understand and respect this idea about positivism. We have this unending desire for a happy news story about climate change, and the reality is that so much of it is so dark and so terrifying that it's paralyzing sometimes. But in terms of storytelling and engaging with the public, what we've found in a number of our engagements is that there are particular angles, particular pieces of a resettlement narrative or of a integration narrative that are accessible to the public, whether that's we need more care workers, we need to, and I don't want to say just care workers, we need a different way of caring for one another that requires more people. That's an access point for us to think about a new way of bringing people into the country and living together. So I want to acknowledge that this positivism conversation is very challenging and it can be a bit suffocating sometimes, I think. But I think that for the average person, those of us in this room are very engaged, obviously, on the topic of climate change, but there are many folks who aren't there yet, and it takes a little bit of an accessible, small piece of that narrative to think about. And behind closed doors, we can maybe say, okay, positivism is getting a little tiring, we need to think realistically here. But at the same time, when we go into the public and engage with folks, we have to be approachable, because if we talk about 10 million climate refugees or 100 million climate refugees, that's quite a startling number. And so, again, acknowledging that the struggle of that narrative, but thinking in small baby steps, how do we start to address that? I think that those little access points are really crucial.
I also just want to touch on, you mentioned, the co-benefits, and to really focus on that in engagements and moving forward. I think that's really, really key to kind of mitigating against the negative potential reactions of people who might perceive it as, we have, say Vancouver, we've got tons of homeless people in the city, and the government is prioritizing refugees that are coming here, giving them social housing, access to the services that people existing here, the existing vulnerable populations, may not have the privilege to access. So I think in moving forward, what's going to be really instrumental is coming up with policy and programming that that benefits all vulnerable populations in your city, whether it's the existing population or the new population. Their needs are oftentimes very similar or the same, and I think it's going to be really highlighting where those stand. That's going to be part of what makes integration or welcoming new people a little bit more acceptable for existing populations.
Thanks, Anna. Got one more question?
So just adding to both of your input, I've been thinking a lot about the role of education in combating this, and in particular when Dr. Huck talked about empowering young people, and like what your thoughts are in empowering our young people to be able to innovate and paradigm shift so that they can create the solutions and be able to, because I think it takes a lot of, as you shared, shifting of minds. Like, we're in this collective room with sort of similar thought processes, but that's not really evident across the board. And so, yeah, I'm really curious to know how projects like yours, Anna, can go into schools and play a role in educating young people.
Yeah, awareness and advocacy is definitely top of mind, especially at the beginning here in our first steps. And I think it's something we hope to carry throughout the entire process of our project. Our first kind of phase, I guess, is to understand the challenge, and that has involved a lot of engagement with the planning profession, but also we're hoping to engage with community members, and that can very much include schools. I think that's definitely a big part of having people be a little bit more, I want to say aware again, but what's the right word? Yeah, I think that proactive element does come from the younger generation in a lot of ways, and if you see some of the most effective campaigns that have come out of paradigm shifts toward, for example, recycling. The recycling program in schools was a huge success, because if you get at the children, they'll get at their parents. So I think you mentioned schools, elementary schools, but I think also universities have a key role to play. A lot of the way that our universities are structured are quite siloed, in the sense that you pick a department and you pick, within that department you pick a certain area of research. And was it you that sent me a blog the other day? Somebody sent me a blog, and it was talking about how universities are failing us because there's no program or degree that you can take that really takes the scale of our global issues and is able to build capacity in a student to be able to deal with that problem at that big scale. We tend to try to simplify things. And so I think that's somewhere we can work on in terms of higher education, to develop programs and degrees and diplomas that force people to think beyond those silos, beyond different departments.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that just really inspired me about what Dr. Huck said, because I always think of Bangladesh as this country that's incredibly vulnerable. And, we've heard a lot about sea level rise and how millions will be displaced. And the idea that you start now with the youth, whose life this is going to be, those are the leaders of tomorrow, the decision makers of tomorrow. So give them the tools, give them the information, and start listening to them about how they'd like to see that leadership occur. I think that's really important, and I hope that we really need to have more of a focus on youth. So thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm going to wrap up here. I just want to tell you that our next and last event in this series, the 5th event, is the Big Picture, and it's happening on November the 8th across the road at the Asia Pacific Hall at the WASC Centre for Dialogue. And we've got internationally renowned oceanographer John Englander, who's the former director of the Cousteau Institute, coming to talk about the big picture on sea level rise, financial risks and opportunities. We've got Gil Kelly, who's the manager of planning for Vancouver, was originally planning manager at San Francisco and Portland. So he's a real leader in some of the ideas that Anna has been discussing tonight. And we also have Sybil Seitsinger, who's the director of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, is a research leader in our area, and also an internationally renowned researcher in her field. So that's going to be really a big wrap-up for this series that we've been running since June, which has covered local planning and issues for Vancouver, First Nations, deep history. We had about 15,000 years of memories of coastal flooding, and the fact that people have adapted to these things in the past, and that traditional knowledge has a great deal to teach us. International policy responses. Last time we had Henk Ovink here from Holland, who was working with Obama on rebuilding after Sandy. This great event today with such a great, three such wise panelists and so much inspiring information. So we hope we'll see you November the 8th. Do register for that, it's selling out quickly. And before we go, I'd like to say thank you to our guests and give them a small but sustainable token of our esteem from SFU. And thank you, and thank you. And thanks to you guys for being here and your great questions and your engagement with this issue.
I just want to grab do you have to run? Not really. 2 seconds. I just want to. We were one of my hosts.